Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the European Studies Centre and the program on modern Poland, our seminar series in week 7. My name is Stefan Szwed. I'm a research associate at the Centre for International Studies at the Department of Politics. And I'm sitting in for Mikołaj today, who unfortunately couldn't join us because of a previous commitment. During the past 7 weeks, we've been discussing some of the key issues in Polish foreign policy, focusing in particular on the themes of change or continuity in Polish foreign policy since the 2015 elections and the victory of the National Conservative Peace government in those elections. Today we're turning to examine Poland's relationship with Germany, arguably most important European partner for Poland, and certainly the most important trade partner, and by many accounts also perhaps the most interesting piece of the change or continuity puzzle in the Polish foreign policy. The rapprochement between Poland and Germany has been hailed as a spectacular success story of the post-Cold War era. During the 1990s, the two countries have reconciled and made enormous progress to get over their past conflict and reorient their relationship towards a shared future. A project that was premised on a confluence of the strategic interest and the mutual interest in enlarging the institutions, the institutional framework of the broader Euro-Atlantic security community. But paradoxically, just as Poland entered NATO and started to negotiate its membership in the EU, things started to go wrong and the relationship deteriorated. Think back to the Iraq War or the constitutional treaty crisis during the mid-2000s. It wasn't really up until 2007 and thereafter, when the Civic Platform government came to power in Poland, that things started to improve again, and subsequently the idea of a Polish-German partnership for Europe was reborn again. And again, it was premised very much on a confluence of interest. Germany increasingly seeking reliable partners in Europe, and Polish elites looking to take the country from a peripheral status in Europe to the very core of the European integration project. Nonetheless, there were several important differences that have persisted, and these differences have now, if you follow the press, if you follow the headlines, the present government has put at the very center of the relationship with Germany. It is these differences and tensions we'll be looking at today, some of the discontinuities, whether there is more substance or style, and some of the issues and problems, and taking stock of the relationship between Poland and Germany in the context of some of the crises that are now engulfing Europe. We have two very distinguished speakers with us today. First of all, Marcin Zaborowski, one of Poland's leading foreign policy analysts. Since 2015, he is the vice president and the head of the Warsaw office of the Center for European Policy Analysis, CIPA. Previously, he was director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw, and before directed the transatlantic program at the European Union Institute of Strategic Studies. He was a lecturer at Aston University and Birmingham University, where he received his PhD, and is the author of numerous books, including, perhaps most topically, Poland, Germany and Europe, Conflict, Cooperation and Europeanization, as well as, together with Kerry Landhurst, the New Atlanticist Poland Foreign Policy, New Atlanticist Poland's Foreign and Security Policy Priorities. I should add that he's also no stranger to the European Studies Centre. We've hosted Marcin last year in a different context of Poland's relations with Turkey. And I have to say he has to be credited with advancing the study of Turkish politics in Poland through his efforts at the peace. As well as before, I believe, as part of the British-Polish roundtable that used to be organized together with the ESC. Klaus Bachmann is Professor of Political Science at the Warsaw School of Social Science and Humanities. Previously, he was Chair of Political Science at the Willy Brandt Center for German and European Studies at the University of Wrocław. And in the past, he held numerous other positions, including fellowships at the Renmin University in Beijing, as well as at the American Center for Contemporary German Studies in Washington, D.C. He also served as a Poland correspondent for a number of German language newspapers from Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, and remains a frequent contributor to Polish media. He specializes in European integration and transitional justice, is an author of many books, including most recently the UN International Criminal Tribunal's Transition Without Justice. Welcome. We're very pleased to have you here. Each speaker will have about 10 to 15 minutes to present his thoughts, and we'll use the remainder of the time for a discussion. Thank you.
How should we proceed?
I would suggest you start, Marcin.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's thank you for this very, very kind introduction. I actually thought I would never be speaking on this issue, but it was, not only emotionally difficult, but at a time when you do your PhD, it's not something you really want to come back to. And so, as I'm sure some of you can sympathize with.
I know the pain of that. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So it's like 4 or 5 years spent on that issue, but then again, it's just kind of one can start feeling younger again. So that's positives in it. Now I understand that Klaus will have a lot of things to say on what is actually contemporary in German politics, and throw the light into what is happening in what kind of implication it might have for relationship with Poland. Now, I thought that I would just give a very basic historical overview that you may wish to comment on. And the reason for that is that, it is sort of believed in Poland that there is kind of a rivalry or conflict that is between Poland and Germany is sort of a very constant, stable and an inherent aspect of Poland's foreign policy. Pretty much since its inception, this is the way the communists let us believe. When you look into the school books of the communist period, you would see that you had a war with Nazi Germany before 1945, but you had a Mieszko I conflict with some German barons or German-speaking barons in 10th century, and then the whole history sort of unravels into how throughout the century there was always this rivalry and problem, and how good Poles were always threatened by not so nice Germans. Klaus wasn't around at the time, so
thank you.
Now the history, when you look into the actual facts, I don't think that it really that the interpretation stands the case really. Quite surprisingly, the border between Poland and or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and various German state was one of the most stable ones until the partition of Poland at the end of the 18th century. It was a very stable border, untouched between late 1200 something and late 790 something. So really one of the most stable fixtures there in Poland, and there were a succession of Saxon and other kings of German or German-speaking ancestry in Poland, with mixed successes or some of them failures, but nonetheless relationship overall between these Polish-speaking polity called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and various German-speaking kingdoms and principalities was pretty distant or just that distant. That started to change, of course, with the partition of Poland, late 20th century, and then the question for Poles, the question of rivalry with the German-speaking people started to be existential, really. Because it was the threat to the existence of a Polish state, but still there were others who were as threatening to the Polish state, if not more so. Poland was partitioned between, as you know, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. All of these partitions were not particularly nice, and by no means the one the part which belonged to Prussia was harsher condition than anybody else. I should know that because I come from Poznan, and it wasn't pretty, but it was the only part of Poland which actually experienced industrial revolution in late 19th century. So there were some benefits to that actually. Now, also, when you had the Second Polish Republic emerging after the Versailles Treaty in 1918, then the relationship to Germany was ambivalent. Piłsudski, the semi-dictatorial leader of the interwar Poland, had some flirtation with first Austrians. Apparently, he was a secret agent working for Austrian imperial services. Is being now used a lot in the context of debate about Wałęsa. But by no means he was anti-German also. I mean, there was nothing like that in him, and he was looking for some sort of accommodation with Germany. It never worked out, but there was a flirtation, and it was part of a concept of foreign policy in the interwar period. So until 1939, that perception that this is the most threatening neighborhood for Poland and the most threatening neighbor to Poland's identity was by no means very prevalent and obvious. This is, historically speaking, this is quite a new thing, actually. Of course, with the Second World War coming up, that perception settled in. And it was something which united both the anti-communist opposition and communist authorities. Germany and Germans were bad guys, and there was something which united the Poles of all stripes. And the problem also, Stalin was clever enough to make sure that this perception would continue to have its geopolitical grounds, because Poland's border was changing the way. Poland lost territories in the east and was compensated in the west by the taking over the former East German territories, and that obviously meant that the two countries were locked in a conflict, and in a conflict which was not just ideological, but it was a real territorial conflict, It was a very clever move because it made sure that that it will be very difficult to find accommodation between whoever will be in power, and whoever will be in power in either West Germany or unified Germany. So far-reaching thinking that was already there during the Stalin period in Russia. Now we see some of that during the Putin era. So there's certainly the element of strategic thinking is quite strong in Russian foreign policy. So the narrative of this eternal rivalry or enmity really dominated history teaching, research. There was the whole institute was being set up in Poznan, called Instytut Zachodni, a Western institute, which was the whole reason for setting it up was to prove and demonstrate that that the newly acquired territories in the West were actually always Polish, which was obviously an absolute nonsense. But it was out there. So the national mythology was being constructed that way. And frankly, it rubbed on not just people who were, communists and who believed in it, but it rubbed on a lot of other people too. Yeah? And when we talk about contemporary Poland, and Polish politics and perception of Germany today, these perceptions need to be re-examined, because I think that a lot of stuff that we hear these days from the leaders of the ruling party in Poland, from the media, which are being owned or ruled by law and justice sympathizers, are are rooted in this kind of a 1960s, 1970, perception learned from the school books which the communists have written. And that's where it's all coming from, really. Now, and it is especially the case for people who are not well versed in reading the foreign press, don't speak foreign languages, and are frankly, in the outlook, rather parochial. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of people who rule today's Poland are people who never read a foreign paper in their life. So that means that their perception of what is going on in the world is rooted really in mythology, however anti-communist they might be, in the history teaching during that they learned about during the communist period. Now, but I just got to be distracted because we're just getting to 1989, and this national mythology of rivalry with Germany, and this threat from Germany is being reconstructed. And what Stefan has already mentioned, this Polish community, Interessengemeinschaft, the community of interest, is emerging as something which is being seen as beneficial for both sides. Parts of his narratives are that there would be no unification of Germany had it not been for the solidarity movement. Poland would have, by the same token, Poland would have never any chance to join the Euro-Atlantic institutions and be fully sovereign without Berlin's support.
And Poland's support for German unification as well.
And Poland's support for German unification, of course, yeah. Stable and democratic Germany was essential for Poland's security and sovereignty. At the same time, stable Poland, EU member state, is good for Germany's security. They don't have to bother that much about what's going on in Ukraine and other, unstable places, because they have this rather stable place east of the border. It's also good for business. Poland is now the number one trading partner of Germany in the entire former Eastern Bloc, including Russia. So there is more trade with Poland than there is trade with Russia, and foreign investment and so on. What we had in the elite narrative following this sort of nice package of community of interest was the comparison of the Polish-German process to the Franco-German rapprochement. And in fact, a lot of institutions which are being set up and mechanisms which are being set up after 1989 were simply modeled on what happened in Franco-German relations since the 1960s, such as youth exchange, cross-border cooperation, school tax commissions, so basically institutions which were copied, adopted to local circumstances, but solutions were well known. Now, that Polish-German reconciliation process is in many respects very successful, despite what you hear from Warsaw these days. The opinion polls are confirming that the polls no longer really see Germany as a threat. They are happy with having a German, not only a German like Klaus, but other Germans as neighbors. But the problem is that this positive perception, however popular and overwhelming it might be, it is also very politicized. It's very political. It is very prevalent for those who are, pro-European. A lot of Poles are pro-European. It's very typical for liberal circles to have a very positive perception of Germany. But at the same time, the right wing is stuck in a sort of historical communist era-rooted perception of Germany. It is still out there, and this is not really changing for what is right of center in Poland.
Before you go further, could you say something about whether this is also the case on the German side? I mean, has the shift been as thorough as on the Polish side? I mean, statistically, it doesn't necessarily look that way, does it?
No, I think for Germany it's not as essential. You know, it's not something which is not one of the key tenets which is modeling. You know, you'll not tell whether a German is right wing or left wing by the views that person has on Poland. And in the Polish case, you know immediately if somebody starts having rants about Germany, you know where they belong politically. You know who you're talking to.
Would rather be the case with Russia in Germany at the moment.
Right. I mean, it's just not such a. I think it's probably important for the German public opinion, but it's not as important as it is for Poles, for both political, geopolitical, but also identity reasons. The last few words I will touch upon presence, and then I will let the rest to Klaus. This government you now have in Poland may seem very popular, but it was actually elected with 34-35% of votes. So it's mostly 33. So it's so dominant in politics because of the electoral system and because of how weak the alternatives were and how divided they were. So this government is certainly skeptical about Germany, if not actually quite anti-German in many respects. With some exceptions, but the overall tone is that, you know, is rooted in this narrative from the 70s and 60s. You can see that in the way how you know, the new foreign policy is being formed. The recent address of Minister of Foreign Affairs. For the first time in Poland, since these addresses were being made, the sort of a State of the Union kind of thing, we call it the expose. So for the first time since 1989, Germany is not named as a principal and important partner. It's just somewhere, you know, behind the UK. You know, the UK is number one, you know, in Europe. You know. Poland, and then the four nations, the Baltic states, you know, Romania, name it, you know, with UK, our trade with UK is 5%. It's a lot. Well, with Germany it was 28 or, you know, something like that. But still, you know, that's you know, obviously part of the reason for that is the Law and Justice in the European Parliament is the same grouping as the Conservatives. So there's a meeting of minds there, perhaps to some extent. Yeah. This is this clear attempt to balance out you know, the importance of Germany with some other possible relations. However, I don't see really this anti-German spirit which you have in the executive, in the government, catching up with the public opinion. It still remains overall favorably disposed towards Germany. In economics, it's very clear Germany does remain Poland's number one partner, and it will remain number one partner for the foreseeable future. I don't think that the UK will take it over anytime soon. And I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to start with apologizing 3 times. First time for the first one because I will be coughing. I'm not entirely healthy. The second one is about the misleading use of the word we, because it may mean we, the Germans, but it also may mean we, the Polish. You have to find out yourself. And the third one is that actually I have nothing to say. So I probably will just limit my presentation to coughing. No, the reason is that Stefan asked me to write a kind of introduction or kind of summary of what I want to say, and what I was writing then was just about what I was busy with, and that's the refugee crisis and German politics. And at the end I realized, and he told me, that there's nothing about Poland there. And I thought, and I started thinking, why is there nothing about Poland? And the easiest way to explain that is that I have the impression that there is no Polish foreign policy at the moment, and there is nothing like German-Polish bilateral relations anymore. So basically that text that is on the website already, I saw it, is about Germany, the refugee crisis, the repercussions, consequences for Europe, for the European Union, and but I think there's nothing about Poland. I hope that somebody would provoke me so that I would have some thoughts about Poland, because this is mainly about Poland as I understand it. And actually, thank you for that. You did. You did both, actually. And so I start totally differently, and I don't want to repeat what I wrote. You can read it anyway online. I would just like to start with a defense of the Polish right-wing government, but not the current one. The one that was slightly criticized in the second half of the 90s, Akcja Wyborcza Solidarność at the time, Buzek government. I was a journalist then in Poland, and as far as I remember, I had a lot of friends in this government, and I was quite supportive for this government, despite the fact that it sometimes also had an anti-German or Germany critical or whatever edge. The difference with today was that at that time it was an open discussion, and it was an open discussion with Germany and with Germans, not only, also with Britain about the British role and whether Poland could follow, and so on and so on. But it happened at a time when everything was still unclear, and both sides had the intention and the ambition to discuss that. So that I could write for right-wing newspapers, and they could write in the German press, and they would exchange views about the future of the European Union, and sometimes they also had very crazy concepts coming from the past, how we could solutions from the Second Republic transform into the Third Republic, or even from the more distant past. It was all possible, and it was about something. And it was obvious that they had ideas, and that they were, it was not only about, getting power and keeping power. That is probably the biggest difference with the situation today. I would even to some extent exonerate or justify the government between 2005 and 2007, because I don't think when you analyze not only what different people in this government said, that is always tricky, and in my opinion, journalists, I was one, so I can present this kind of self-criticism here, they tend to focus too much on words and not enough on deeds, on actions. When you look what the Marcinkiewicz-Kaczynski government actually did, what they signed, what they agreed to, decisions they took at this time, then you can see that the harm that, if they ever did any harm to European integration, could have been much bigger if they really had wanted. And actually the outcome was, in my opinion, basically more or less the same that would have been achieved by any Polish government at the time, and it was not harmful to European integration. All the things that we heard about enlargement and about the Polish concepts about the constitutional treaty or the Lisbon Treaty later on, actually when we look at the decision-making process after 2004, then we see it did not make much of a difference. This is also different now, because I think the approach when it comes to European integration, 2005, 2007, was also was rooted in a kind of lack of concepts, which just meant that the government did what partners in Western Europe expected them to do, and then sold it in sometimes nationalist rhetoric to their own public, but they did what was necessary to do. Today we have a situation where no decisions are taken, and it's even not justified, because I mean you can justify a decision that you take, but can you justify a decision that you do not take? It's the Polish zanikanie. Zanikanie does not need justification. So that Poland, in my view, is slowly vanishing from the European Union just by doing nothing. Not by doing things that are harmful, just by doing nothing, by staying on the side, by passively watching what happens, by lack of initiative. And the same, to a much larger extent, happens in bilateral relations, that means between Poland and Germany. Because in former times, even before the first visit of President Duda in Berlin, we had at least the usual, I don't want to say the usual suspects, but the usual arguments, about should Poles in Germany be treated as a minority? Should the German-Polish treaty be revised? What about the second pipeline? What about Ukraine? What about Russia? What about, things that you can discuss? You may not agree on that, but it's something that you can discuss. A dialogue is possible. Now, when Prime Minister Szydło goes to Berlin, there's nothing. And when she comes back, there's nothing. And the German diplomats, German politicians, they watched. I say, okay, but why did she come? I mean, the only outcome of the meeting was that Germany and Poland agreed to build together a hospital in, I think it was Lebanon. That is the contribution to the refugee crisis. This is something that Angela Merkel could have done with a famous actor in Germany who committed part of his income to building a refugee home in Hamburg. She doesn't need Poland to do that. But this is not what anybody would expect, So, Polish foreign policy, bilateral relations are vanishing. Today, or this year, we have 25 years of the Polish-German treaty, which is a big issue in Germany and almost no issue at all in Poland. And the highlight or the peak of these events, of all these events that were meant to take place during this year, are the so-called governmental consultations, which once they take place in Poland, next year they take place in Germany, and in good times, usually you have half or even more of the members of both cabinets meeting bilaterally and in the plenum and everywhere. This year they have been cancelled. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentations, very complimentary presentations. We first heard the historical overview and account of the way these relations have shaped since 1989. And then from Klaus, a bit more about the contemporary state of those relations in the context of some of the pressing issues today. We don't have a discussant as such for this session, but maybe I'll assume the privilege of a chair and start with a first remark and a question. For you, Marcin, I'm quite taken by this idea of this mythology of eternal Polish-German competition and animosity. And of course, this narrative has dominated the relationship between Germany and Poland throughout the Cold War era, and you rightly point out to some of the structural, some of the geopolitical factors that sustain it, the border question, for instance. But leaving the communist propaganda aside, the idea that infinite animosity divides Poland and Germany is not just sort of a culturalist argument. This is not sort of a Polish vansitartism about imperfectibility of the German, but is in some form goes to the core of the German question in Europe, the Gretchenfrage, the German power in Europe. And related to that, Poland's relative weakness. In fact, there's a whole host of structural asymmetries that were at the back of that mythology of Polish-German competition. Power asymmetries that you mentioned, geopolitical asymmetries, Poland's location in a very difficult neighborhood, drafty between two much more powerful states. And also, I guess to some extent, what Ernst Bloch would call this Ungleichzeitigkeit, a kind of temporal asymmetry in a way that because Germany could participate in all modern developments the way that Poland couldn't, and developments that reached Poland with a bit of a delay, therefore only underlining its cultural distinctiveness. So this mythology of this animosity was very much expressed in culturalist terms, but in fact, I would argue that it's much more rooted in structural asymmetries that existed and perhaps continue to exist today, but under very different conditions. We have these international institutions that supposedly diffuse asymmetries, democratize relations between countries, make reconciliation, or in our political science terms, cooperation possible. That's all fine, but these asymmetries remain, and I guess that the question that arises is how do they matter today? What is the role in the way that they structure differences between Germany and Poland? And I guess that also goes to the root of what you're saying. I mean, the peace perception of this is rooted in the history of 1960s. I mean, just to play devil's advocate, there are a few sort of more reasonable people on that side of the spectrum who see it a little bit differently. It's not about history, but it's much more about these inequalities that are built into the system that perhaps disadvantage some actors in Europe, and perhaps Poland is getting a raw deal. And should we listen to those voices? And what do you think is possible in terms of a genuine Polish-German partnership in Europe, given those asymmetries? I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Stefan. All very good points. You know, what I was trying to say, obviously not completely clearly enough, is that the animosity has some real ground, and it is very real. And you know, I mean, anybody of us who is of certain age in Poland knows how deep it really was, and to some extent really is. You know, I think that it would be, for example, for our parents, it would be almost impossible to come across with some rational argument that, look, that this animosity is kind of, you know, recently it hasn't been always fair and all of that. Yeah, they would not listen to that. So for certain generation, it's seen as an inherent and obvious and always out there. However, the point that I was trying to make is that the animosity, in fact, is historically not as deep and is not as ever existing as it is generally believed. But you know, Poland's or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth structural weakness during the 17th and during the 18th century simply meant that some predatory states, Prussia included, have used that weakness to expand, just like you know, the Polish Commonwealth was expanding in the past. So that was just a kind of a rational behavior of any state at this point in time. And until really the Second World War, the perception of that it was eternal, that was always out there, wasn't as prevalent as it was after that tragic event. So, number one, is not as historically, you know, deep and old as it is believed. And number two, you know, I think in politics, in international politics, nothing is ever set in stone. Things can be reversed and changed. And my belief is that the successful democratization of Germany and the Germany's integration, West Germany's integration with Western structure simply changed it in such a profound way that that strong Germany started to be a threat, but started to be a cornerstone of Poland's security. And those who were deeply in favor, who were sovereignist, a sort of positive nationalists in Poland in the late 1980s, would want to have strong Germany. So it's a reverse of what would have been there during the interwar period. Historically speaking, the elites of Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth would think that there was eternal animosity with Turkey. Who remembers about it today?
It's coming back, isn't it?
Today in the sort of the official discourse, you have all these, beautiful romantic stories about, how Turks never recognized the partition of Poland and, the Polish village in Istanbul and so on. If you read the writing in the 17th, 18th century, it's almost like reading about Germany today. So things can change simply. And those who are open about the fact that nothing is set in stone realize it and can move on. The others can't.
Thank you. Klaus, maybe to you. I mean, just the visit of Duda to Berlin was preceded with an article by Mr. Szczecki, who listed those 4 conditions. That's quite a shift in Polish-German relationship. We now have conditions for partnership with Germany.
At the beginning, it was presented as some kind of precondition, and then it was just the topics for, But officially, I mean, when you ask in press conferences or interviews, then you will always get the answer from the current Polish government that no, we are not anti-German. That's one thing. And the other thing is what the internal discussions are, and especially what the media that are supportive to the government, what they sometimes do, and they have this kind of asymmetry that you have a German journal or German newspaper criticizing the Polish government or ridiculizing the Polish government, or this famous wagon during the carnival in Cologne, which immediately arouses a reaction from foreign ministry, or like the BBC documentary, and they react to everything. And at the same time, newspaper that is funded by the same sources like the party and has a member of the Senate and from peace and so on, for example, covers its first page with Angela Merkel in a Nazi uniform, and nobody is saying, oh, this is not the government. I mean, this was immediately when some of the German politicians started to talk about Putinization in Poland, and immediately, wow, what does the government say? And then the government said, well, no, this is not us. This is, of course, a strategy. This is a German strategy at the moment. But you don't have the same reaction on the Polish side, and the German side doesn't expect or doesn't even request such a reaction. So officially everything is all right, because otherwise the current government would be in a very unpleasant situation, because it would be at the same time openly anti-Russian. It would be anti-German, which is in itself, would make all alarm clocks belling in Poland immediately. There's a different problem with Ukraine, which is much more complicated and obscure, I would say, because here it's also not really obvious where the current government stands. In order to be not against everybody, even being criticized by US senators, for example, you have at least to keep to pretend that everything is okay with Berlin. So that's the official reaction. From when it comes to the German strategy, then there's a very very clear indication, and it was even sometimes it was even mentioned in public. Germany is not going to criticize Poland for the things that happen inside Poland. and even those politicians who were not member of the government and who started to criticize now, they are very silent now. We'll see what happens when the verdict from the Constitutional Court comes and the government reaction to that and the Venice Commission and everything. But I don't think that it will be a repetition. First of all, as Marcin already said, I mean, it is not a salient point or in German internal politics what kind of relation we have with Poland. It once was on the far right or on the right edge of the Christian Democrats, the expulsion movement. For them, it was an important issue, and they tried to get to the German public with that message. But it's no longer, because they have been totally sidelined, marginalized, also for demographic reasons.
But also because they achieved what they were looking for, right? I mean,
no, actually, they didn't. No, that's a different topic. But it's not an issue anymore. So I mean, you can make your position clear as a German politician when you make a statement about Russia, when you make a statement about the United States, about TTIP, or about Turkey. Yes, of course. But with regard to Poland, it's very, very difficult. It's not really convincing, and it's not something that will bring you a lot of, well, it doesn't even arouse awareness or something like that. So I don't think that there will be a repetition of that. What the German government and German politicians will do is just to hide behind the Venice Commission and the European Commission. And they both will hide behind the Constitutional Court. And the only message that goes out from that will be that well, we want Poland to respect the verdicts of its own constitutional court. And whenever you have a problem, and you come to Brussels or you come to Berlin, the first thing that you will hear is, oh, we are not meddling with internal politics in Poland, but you have this problem with the Venice Commission and with the European Commission, and first you should solve it. So in order to avoid this kind of anti-German, German critical or whatever responses that were the result of these of Martin Schulz's or Volker Kauder's criticism a few weeks ago. Sorry, but probably I interrupted you with your question.
No, thank you. Well, I mean, I wanted to ask you about which of those fields, of those four conditions that Szczerski has named, you think some progress could be made on. I mean, there's the issue of the rights of the Poles in Germany, as you mentioned yourself, the Germany's blockage of NATO's posturing in the east, or strengthening the eastern flank. There is the issue of Polish coal and climate issues. Also eastern policy, I mean, I suppose that pertains mostly to Ukraine and Poland's inclusion in the Normandy format. I mean, do you see any opportunity for actually making progress on any of those four issues?
And the problem with the Poles in Germany is the very tricky legal issue behind that, and also the problem with German federalism, because for most of the demands of the Polish government, it's the Länder that are responsible for that, and sometimes even on a lower level. There's also a problem with the perception, because some of the things that Polish politicians and members of the, let's say, Poles living in Germany want to get, they can get, but they cannot get it on the ethnic ticket. That's, I mean, I'll give you an example. If you want your children to learn Polish in a German school, and you go there and you go to the director and say, I'm a member of the Polish community, of Polish minority in Germany, and I want my child to learn Polish here, then the director say, okay, but it's just you. When you go there with other parents, who may not necessarily be Polish, and very often they are not, mixed marriages, sometimes even people from other countries, they just think it's important. You go there and say, yeah, you have here 8 children and you think they should learn Polish. You can get it because you are a group. And the director has to respect, the wish of the number of parents. And very often I had this kind of meetings in various parts of Germany where you have parents who achieve that actually. And sometimes you even have a Vietnamese girl that learns Polish that way. In other parts of Germany, you may have Vietnamese, or you may have whatever. I mean, French. I actually come from a border region with France, where our first foreign language was French, was not English. English came later. That's the problem. But the problem is that those people in Germany who try to get these kind of concessions, they try to get it on an ethnic ticket, which makes it immediately suspicious for Germans who do not think in this, ethnic category. Whereas, of course, it's very attractive for the Polish public, where this kind of thinking is much more important.
But Klaus, Germany demanded, you say Germans don't think along these ethnic lines, but he demanded that right for the Germans in other countries, on ethnic lines, including Silesia, for instance.
That is, yes and no. I mean,
yes, the answer is yes.
The answer is yes, because at the time, it's also changed to a large extent. There was a distinct and concentrated ethnic minority in Upper Silesia, and of course, they could also refer to the Polish constitution, where these kind of privileges for ethnic minorities were there, and they were applied to them. That's the problem, that in Germany we also have these ethnic minorities, 2 of them, which have these kind of privileges. The problem is that if we apply the same legal definition for Poles living in Germany, the same definition for minority that were applied to these 2 groups, I mean to the Danish people in the north and to the Serbs in the southeast, if we apply the same definition, then most Poles would not be covered by it. This is something that is very difficult to explain to people like Duda, for example, that this very fuzzy definition in the German-Polish treaty, which says Poles living in Germany who want something, is actually much larger than any definition that would be based on minority, because minority would mean they have to be the citizens of that country. I mean, all the Upper Silesians are citizens of Poland. I'm not a member of the German minority in Poland. I always used to say I'm a member of the majority. But when it comes to Germany, then you have, I mean, people who have their roots in Polish culture, history, and so on, but they are not interested in this kind of privileges. They usually live in the Ruhrgebiet. They have Polish names, but they don't speak Polish anymore. What you have is a lot of people who actually don't have German citizenship, but want these kind of privileges. And thanks to the German-Polish treaty, they can get some of them, not all of them. They can get some of them. But actually, if we would apply the same definition as in Upper Silesia, then they would not get it.
Okay. I would suggest we open up for a question.